Oh, howdy all, grab yourself a drink. It is time for some Path of Exile 2 discussion. Today, I wanted to talk about the Blood Mage, how it's going, the particular take that I had on it, and what I've done differently to the original plan, and also my general thoughts on this Ascendancy and a couple of other ones. So, let's start with what I've done. Firstly, I have not followed my original plan exactly, and that's for a pretty good reason. It turns out that life recovery is really, really tight in Path of Exile 2, and it's one of those really powerful things that you want to have a bunch of on your character. So I've spec'd into Resilient Soul and the surrounding good nodes. So Devoted Protector is something that's fantastic, 0.5% life regen per second. I'd take it just for that, but it comes with more. I'm actually content with this travel node. This one here has 5% of damage taken recouped as life. That's fine. And also 20% multiplier to your life regeneration rate. Then we have this other node, and honestly we could take this one as well. And then we have Relentless Vindicator, which is just a good stuff node, doesn't really have anything much to do with the rest of the character. It's just too good not to take when it's 1 point. Now, the first thing to note is that the original data mine information had this section of the passive tree on the witch be different to what it turned out to be. That's because there's different passive trees, at least in the starting diamond, for the witch as to what there is for the sorceress. And the sorceress one bled through to the witch, which was a mistake. So that meant that instead of pathing out this way as that originally planned through a bunch of like middling to good elemental nodes, we have to instead path out through some crit nodes that are a bit disappointing. They're not terrible, but they're not amazing either. Anyways, that gets us to here, after which point I'm working my way towards Exploit the Elements at the moment, haven't taken it. But what I did take was the Echoing Cluster here. That's sublime, that's just incredible. I have not taken the Recoup down here that I was planning on taking, and I've also unspec'd this Recoup. Now, there's a couple of reasons for this. Firstly, there's a slightly better Recoup cluster up here, and I do want to come up to the top anyway. So I've taken this, mostly because Glazed Flesh is better than the notables down below. But also, as well as that, I've also had to come up here, grab the things that I was expecting to take up in this area. Again, the fact that I've got this flat life regen down here, or percentage of your life recovery, this has been really, really good. And honestly, this is just better than recoup nodes that are available in this area of the tree are. So with that out of the way, that's what we're doing from a defensive standpoint. Let's talk about the Blood Mage Ascendancy, shall we? So Sangomancy. Sangomancy is the node you're forced to take first. This is so bad early in the game that it's actually detrimental. Your character is stronger if you don't click this node, and if you have already clicked it, what you're wanting to do is unspec that node. The hooded one will do that for you. You'll be able to remove just that one node. You'll still get the benefit of the single point before it, but that's only 3% ink life. It's, you know, it's fine. You're okay with it. But essentially, until you get your second Ascendancy, you are playing unascended, except for that 3% maximum life. That's the first issue with the Blood Mage Ascendancy. The second issue with it is that Sangomancy's drawback is probably a bit more severe than we thought. The reason for this is that boss hit points are extremely high. You've seen me fighting the Devourer in the background here. Other bosses throughout the game can have really, really high hit points, even starting with the boss of Act 2. The boss of Act 2 has, I believe, about 120,000 health, and so you need to throw thousands of mana worth of spells in order to kill him. Well, if you're spending thousands of mana worth of spells, with Sangomancy you're also spending thousands of life. When you're spending thousands of life, you can do that from your life flasks, but this means you have something like 6 or 7 less life flask charges to use, counteracting any mistakes you make. Now, this does cause remnants to drop. They will drop on a critical hit against the boss, but they'll drop at the feet of the boss, and that I think is a thing that wasn't apparent early on. When these life remnants drop at the boss's feet, there are some bosses, like the Act 3 boss, where this is fine. You want to be standing in point blank range with this boss. But the Act 2 boss, you do not want to be in point blank range most of the time. And so this means you either have to duck into potentially danger and then duck back out, or alternately, you have to miss out on your life remnant. And that means that you're just basically hemorrhaging a whole bunch of life points. Now, you can improve this a lot when you pick up Vitality Siphon, and Vitality Siphon feels mandatory, but even then, it's just not really all that great. And so at the moment, whilst I've got Sangomancy and Vitality Siphon, and they sort of counter each other out somewhat, this ends up leaving you a bit behind. Now, I do think there's more power in the Blood Mage once you do pick up more of the Ascendancy, But it is actually quite tough to get through the earlier acts without this power. And so that's one of the reasons that there are so few Blood Mages tearing up the ladder. If you have a look at the 1,000 top players by XP at the moment, there are exactly 10 Blood Mages. Fun fact, it's not the bottom Ascendancy. The bottom Ascendancy is the Acolyte of Chayula, which is represented by 4 people. On the flip side, a couple of the other Ascendancies that are doing better, the Invoker, the Stormcaller, some of these have got more than 200 people playing them, and then there's a bunch of things that are somewhere in the middle. Anyways, that's part of the thing with early access. There's a bunch of balance issues grinding your games have to get sorted. There are a few that are critical, and ultimately the critical ones are the ones that could potentially put someone tremendously ahead. The ones that put someone behind are generally less disruptive to the game if they're left alone. That's what we've got so far. In the background, I've been just showing some footage of some Act 1 cruel, so Act 4 monster killing. Hopefully that's been useful. But that's a bit of a sense of where the Ascendancy is at the moment. What are my thoughts? Do I recommend the Ascendancy? Not really. I think it's just not as strong as other alternatives. There's a bunch of fun stuff it's got in it, and I do think it may get better over time. But right now, based on its current power on the live servers, I'd say it's probably best to go with something else. If you're already in the Ascendancy though, then there is power here. The key thing is that it's going to be slow onset to get to it. Now, I've had a lot of people asking what my gems are. I'm not convinced that these gems are all perfect or anything like it. But the single most important thing is Frostwall. Frostwall is a skill you can't get until you start getting level 11 gems dropping. And if my memory serves me correctly, that is quite late in Act 3. What this will allow you to do is put up a wall that, when it explodes, will deal pretty substantial cold damage to everything around it. How do you make them explode? Well, that is what Fireball is for. Fireball has been a bit of an MVP here. Remember that we're getting bonuses when we inflict shock, chill, and ignite. So, we kind of want to be doing a bunch of these different things. What I tend to do in a fight is I will start out, if it's likely to be a short one, I'll drop Flame Wall linked to Fortress, which causes the Flame Wall to spawn in a circle instead, and then I will throw a bunch of fireballs through it. I'll then just keep running. That's my usual plan if the enemies are weak. If the enemies are weak but not quite that weak, so not weak enough that I can one-shot them with that strategy, then I'll often follow in with some sparks as well. My Fireball gem is pretty heavily supported at the moment. It's the only 4-link I've got, but if you don't have a 4-link, which requires a lesser Jeweler's Orb, then just drop Fire Penetration from it. The key thing is Scattershot and Unleash. These two are fantastic. They'll let you be able to throw out 9 fireballs at a time, as long as you're not trying to spam Fireball. If you try and spam Fireball, then you'll have a bad time, because Unleash will just make it cost more and not give any bonus. Now, what we're doing here is we're firing these through a flame wall, so they end up picking up an extra bonus damage from that. On top of that, they end up igniting hotter than they otherwise would. Now, at the same time, we are also using our Frost Wall as something that these projectiles can then impact and can cause things to go boom. As for the rest of the gems, I'm not set on everything else. I'm currently using, so I've got the setup that you've talked about there. Flame Wall is currently linked to Fortress and Arcane Tempo at the moment, which is faster casting. Arcane Tempo is not irreplaceable here. You can put something else there if you want. I've got Arcane Tempo because of one main reason, and that is that I find myself unintentionally cancelling my cast of Flame Wall without it, because it's a fairly slow spell to cast. Spark is next. Spark is something that does a bunch of damage for you, but most importantly, the projectiles from it pick up a bit of the flame from the Flame Wall and deliver it to the enemies. This is something I was using a lot more earlier on in progression. I've currently got Conduction and Rising Tempest here. I'm not really that happy with that setup, but it's also not terrible. I occasionally use Ice Nova and Frostbolt, and these are mostly to inflict chill and also potentially to build up for a big freeze on an enemy. Now, Ice Nova is currently linked to Glaciation support and to Spell Echo, and I'm considering moving Glaciation over to my Reservation gem, which is Arctic Armor, but I'm not convinced I'm going to do that. Part of the reason for that is I would need more Spirit in order to do that. Frostbolt is linked to Considered Casting currently because it does a surprising amount of damage, and also to Cold Pen, but these are not required. You could definitely put something else there. Then we have the reservations, Arctic Armor, Raging Spirits. Arctic Armor, I will sing the praises of this gem. This is not a defensive gem, this is a retaliation skill. This is like Path of Exile 1 Thorns on Armor. The difference is, unlike Thorns on Armor, it's big, it does a lot of damage, it often crits, not super often, but often enough to matter, and the backlash damage from it is really wild. It will often freeze the enemy and also deal an appreciable chunk of damage to it, and this can be really good on bosses sometimes too. If a boss has a soft melee attack that you can just face tank, Arctic Armor is a good way to really mess them up for deciding to attack you. So that's Arctic Armor. Raging Spirits, I'm less certain of. It probably could go, but it does cause you to have a bunch of utility little summon Raging Spirits. Their primary purpose, because we're not scaling minion damage, the primary purpose isn't really the damage that they do. That's a bonus. The primary purpose is the fact that they interrupt energy shield recharge, and that can be really useful a bunch of the time. So essentially, as long as you've done damage to an enemy with fire sort of recently, Raging Spirits will keep them unable to recover energy shield for a while. I have Ball Lightning. I'm experimenting with this. I'm not yet sold on it. I currently have it with Magnified Effect and with Deceleration. Again, not sold on this. And then there's Fireball, as we said. Fireball, Scattershot, Unleash, and the optional Fire Pen. Anyways, that's what we're looking at currently. That's the skill tree and my overall thoughts on this Ascendancy. I think there's a bit of a case to be made for some balance changes here, but the Ascendancy's fun to play. It just feels like it's a little bit under the power curve. In terms of itemization, what you're looking for, I've got pretty bad items on my wands now. They were good when I got them, but that was the end of Act 2. So +2 to the level of all spell skills and some spell damage, and mana's not really a live mod. Here we have this shield, which is, again, like it's got some good stuff on it. It's got the fire damage, it's got the spell skills, it's got the cast speed, got some mana mods, which again, I'm not sad to have them, and that's the entirety of that item. Then I have a helmet that's pretty solid for early game, 59 life, and a total, once we include sockets, of 37 to resistances. A chest piece, which is fantastic for resists. So once you include sockets, this is up in the 61% resist range, also with 62 max life. And this is one that dropped for me as it is, except minus the thorns. I unfortunately exalted the thorns on, and I also had to apply Artificer's Orbs to get those 2 sockets on it. This Amethyst ring is trash, but it has rarity, and rarity seems to be really good. This Sapphire ring is just trash, and this amulet is quite a bit better, but still not very great. Then we have a belt that I'm quite impressed with, not ecstatic, but quite solid. And we have boots that I've been using since, when did I get these? Given that they are item level 18, I would say I got them at the very start of Act 2, and they've served me well ever since, but I wouldn't mind an upgrade. I feel like I'm a bit overdue for it. Glove slot is basically being used for life and rarity. It has some cold resist too, which is good, and of course lightning resistance in that extra slot. So that's the gear that I've got. In terms of gear that I would go for, I would focus on trying to build up your life and resistances on gear mostly, but dedicate your weapon slot and your offhand to damage. Now this could be together with one staff, or you could use a caster stick in one hand and then use a focus in the offhand. Focus is the term for an intelligence-based shield now. If it's pure intelligence, then it will not have block. It'll instead just have its own mod pool. And those mods include things like plus the level of all skills, plus the level of a class's skills, plus spell damage, plus single element damage, whole lot of good stuff like that. Anyways, hopefully this has been clear as mud. That's my thoughts on the Ascendancy, and some gameplay footage to go with it of me fighting the Devourer and some trash in Act 4. May your Varlorbs have interesting results.